Bellora was the kind of city that made people trust it too quickly. In the morning, the light fell softly over old stone streets and narrow lanes that curved toward the river. Bakers opened their shutters before sunrise. Fishermen moved quietly at the harbour. Church bells rang through the colder months like they had been ringing forever. Children ran through the alleys in uniforms. Old men took their coffee at the same cafes every day, and women leaned over their balconies to shake dust from tablecloths and call down to neighbours. From far away, Bellora looked calm. From the hills above the city, if you stood high enough, you would see rooftops packed closely together, sunlight touching windows, smoke lifting from chimneys, and the wide river cutting through the middle like a silver road. It looked like the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. But the people who had lived there long enough knew better. Bellora had two lives. The first life was the one everyone could see. The shops, the schools, the flowers in the market, the weddings in church, the little arguments between neighbours, the men reading newspapers on benches, the laughter spilling out of restaurants late at night. The second life was quieter. It lived behind closed doors and half-shut curtains. It moved through back rooms, private dinners, black cars, and old family names. It travelled through whispers. It changed hands over coffee, over wine, over promises that were never written down. And in Bellora, some names carried more weight than others. One of those names was Valentieri. In Santiero, one of the oldest districts in the city, the Valentieri house stood behind high walls and black iron gates. It was not the biggest house in Bellora, and it was not the newest, but it was one of the houses people recognized without needing to say the name out loud. Even the taxi drivers knew. If someone said, "Take me near the gates on Via Salerno," the driver already understood. The Valentieri family had lived in Bellora for longer than most people could remember. Their roots in the city were old enough that some said Bellora had shaped them, and others said they had shaped Bellora. At the head of the family was Vittorio Valentieri. He was a man of measured words, neat suits, and quiet certainty. He did not shout. He did not boast. He did not rush. If Vittorio entered a room, the room changed. Not because he demanded attention, but because people naturally gave it to him. His wife, Elena Valentieri, carried a different kind of strength. She brought warmth where Vittorio brought order. She saw things people missed. She spoke gently, but in a way that made people listen. Guests who visited the house often remembered her smile, but forgot that she had quietly learned everything about them before dessert. Their children were different from one another in nearly every way. Marco, the oldest son, was handsome, confident, and full of energy. He moved fast, spoke fast, and believed almost every room was improved by his presence. He laughed easily, got angry quickly, and hated feeling ignored. Sophia, the only daughter, had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. She noticed weakness immediately and had little patience for foolish men, which meant she often had little patience at all. She loved her family deeply, but she saw through them too clearly to romanticize them. And then there was the youngest, Luca Valentieri. When this story begins, Luca is 9 years old. He is quiet, observant, and already different. He is the kind of boy who notices when a picture frame has been moved 2 inches to the left. The kind of boy who remembers what someone said 3 weeks ago and the exact way they said it. The kind of boy who listens not just to words, but to pauses. At that age, most people still thought of him as shy. They were wrong. Luca was not shy. He was watching. That evening, rain pressed softly against the tall windows of the Valentieri dining room. A fire burned low in the next room, and the whole house carried the smell of roasted lamb, fresh bread, garlic, and polished wood. The dining room itself was warm and elegant without trying too hard. A long table ran down the center, covered in white linen. Silver shone in the candlelight. A bowl of pears sat in the middle among tall flowers arranged by Elena herself, because she trusted no one else to do it properly. The family was halfway through dinner. Marco was talking, as usual. "I'm telling you," he said, gesturing with his fork. "If Nico hadn't pushed me from behind, I would have scored." Sophia didn't even look up from her plate. "You missed because you always rush." Marco turned to her. "That is not true. It is completely true." "You weren't even there." Sophia tore off a small piece of bread. "I don't need to be there. I know you." Marco laughed. "You know nothing." Elena lifted her eyes from her glass. "Marco." "Yes, Mama." "Put the fork down when you talk." He smiled. "I am talking with passion." "You are talking with cutlery." Luca looked down so no one would see him smiling. At the head of the table, Vittorio noticed anyway. "You find this amusing?" he asked. Luca looked up. "Yes, Papa." Marco pointed across the table. "There, see? He does laugh. He just hides it." Luca frowned slightly. "I don't hide it." Marco grinned. "You do. You laugh like it's a secret." Sophia leaned back in her chair and studied Luca. "That's because he listens first." Marco scoffed. "He listens too much." Vittorio cut a small piece of lamb with calm precision. "Listening," he said, "is rarely a weakness." Marco shook his head. "In this house, apparently everything I do is a weakness." Elena answered without missing a beat. "Only the unnecessary parts." Sophia laughed. Marco put a hand to his chest. "That hurts." "It should," Sophia said. Luca smiled again. This time, Elena saw it. "There," she said softly. "That's better. You should smile more." Luca shrugged. "Why?" "Because," she said, "it helps people know what you're feeling." Sophia raised one eyebrow. "Maybe he doesn't want them to know." The room went still for just a second. Not because Sophia was wrong, because she was right. Vittorio's eyes moved briefly to Luca. There was no smile on his face, but there was something close to approval. That was another thing Luca noticed. In the Valentieri house, silence had meaning. Different kinds of silence meant different things. There was comfortable silence, warning silence, thinking silence, angry silence, and the silence that followed truth. Luca was learning the difference without anyone teaching him directly. When dinner ended, Elena rose first. "Sophia, come help me check the flowers in the front room." Sophia sighed lightly but stood. "I checked them before dinner." "And now you'll check them after." Marco laughed. "You are the only girl your age in Bellora who gets punished with flower duty." Sophia looked at him coldly. "And you are the only boy your age in Bellora who thinks he's charming while saying stupid things." Marco put a hand over his heart again. "Another wound." Elena walked past him. "You'll live." Sophia followed her out, and Marco wandered toward the courtyard, slipping something small and white from his pocket. Luca guessed it was a cigarette. Vittorio remained at the table for a moment, finishing his coffee. Luca sat with the dessert spoon in his hand, looking at the pattern in the tablecloth. Vittorio stood and paused behind him. "You line them up," he said. Luca looked up. "What?" "The spoons, the knives, the glasses." Vittorio nodded toward the place settings. Whenever someone leaves one crooked, you straighten it. Luca glanced at the spoon in his hand. I like when things are in order. Vittorio considered that for a moment. Then he said, most problems begin when something small is out of place and no one corrects it. Luca looked at him carefully. Was that just a sentence? Or was it a lesson? With Vittorio, it was often both. Then the bell rang at the front of the house. Not the servant bell from the side entrance. The main bell. Low, heavy, serious. Elena looked up from the doorway of the next room. At this hour? Vittorio was already moving toward the hall. Luca slid out of his chair and stood. A moment later, the front door opened and a deep, rough voice carried in from the entrance. Vittorio. It was Renato Valentieri, Vittorio's cousin. Renato was the kind of man children noticed even when they did not understand him. Thick around the shoulders, broad hands, heavy coat, thick eyebrows, and a face that always looked like he had just finished disagreeing with someone. He did not smile often, and when he did, it usually meant trouble for somebody else. He stepped into the hallway, rain still on his coat. There's a problem, he said. Elena appeared behind Vittorio. Can it wait? Renato shook his head once. No. Vittorio said, My office. The two men disappeared down the hallway. Luca stood frozen for a second. Then he moved. Quietly. Not all the way to the office, not right to the door. He knew better than that. He moved to the staircase near the hallway and sat 3 steps up, where the shadows hid him and the voices still carried. Inside the office, chairs moved. A drawer opened. Then Renato spoke. It's Dino Falco. Luca knew that name. Dino owned a restaurant near the harbour, the kind of restaurant where fishermen ate before sunrise and couples stayed too long over wine after dark. Dino had known the Valentieris for years. Vittorio's voice was low and even. What about him? 3 men stood outside his place again. Same 2 from before, plus 1 new face. A pause. Did they go in? Vittorio asked. No. Did they speak to anyone? Not this time. Vittorio was silent for a moment. Then he said, They want the room to feel smaller before they ask for anything. Renato grunted in agreement. Luca pressed his hand lightly against the stair beside him. He did not understand everything, but he understood enough to know that Dino was in trouble. Renato continued. He's rattled. His wife too. Have him come in tomorrow. You want him to open the restaurant? Yes. Renato sounded doubtful. After this? Vittorio's answer came without hesitation. If he closes, Bellora sees fear before breakfast. I won't have that. The sentence settled into Luca's mind. Bellora sees fear before breakfast. He didn't fully know what it meant, but he knew it mattered. Then, beneath Luca's foot, the stair gave the smallest creak. Inside the office, silence fell so completely that Luca's heart seemed suddenly too loud. Then Vittorio said, not sharply, not loudly, but with absolute certainty, Luca. He froze. Come in. There was no point pretending otherwise. Luca stood slowly, smoothed the front of his shirt with both hands, and entered the office. Renato looked at him, then at Vittorio. This one, Renato muttered, moves like a cat. Luca stayed near the door. Vittorio sat behind the desk with his hands folded. Were you listening? Luca swallowed. Yes. Renato let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. At least he doesn't lie. Right then, Elena appeared at the office door, as if she had known exactly where Luca would be. "Luca Valentieri," she said quietly. "You should be upstairs." "Yes, Mama." But he didn't move. Vittorio looked at him for another moment. "Tell me what you heard." Luca looked from his father to Renato and back again. "That Dino Falco is in trouble." Vittorio nodded once. "What else?" Luca thought. "The men outside his restaurant want people to feel scared." Renato crossed his arms. "And?" Luca turned toward Vittorio. "You don't want them to." Vittorio's face did not change. "Why?" Luca took his time. He had already learned that with his father, fast answers were often shallow ones. "Because if people see one man look weak," Luca said slowly, "other people will start acting brave." The room was quiet. Renato looked sideways at Vittorio with something like surprise. Elena's expression softened, though she still looked unhappy that her son had been eavesdropping. Finally, Vittorio said only this: "Go upstairs." Luca nodded. "Yes, Papa." As he turned toward the door, Renato said, "He hears too much." Elena answered, "He's a child." Renato looked after Luca as he left. "Not for long." Luca heard that. He carried it upstairs with him. Not for long. The next morning, Bellora woke under grey skies and a soft rain that made the cobblestones shine like dark glass. In the Valentieri kitchen, the day had already begun before sunrise. The housekeeper moved between pans and cups with swift, quiet hands. Coffee filled the air. Bread warmed in the oven. Eleanor stood by the long counter, correcting the angle of a flower stem in a vase because one of them leaned too far left. Luca came in dressed neatly, hair combed, shoes polished. Elena turned and smiled. "You're early." He shrugged. "I'm awake." She kissed the top of his head. "That makes one of my sons." As if on cue, Marco entered a moment later looking half dead. He yawned, dropped into a chair and stared at the table. Why does morning exist? Sophia was already there with tea. "To punish you personally," she said. Marco glared at her. "You wake up cruel." "I wake up correct." Luca smiled into his cup. Marco pointed. Again, secret laughing. Elena set a plate in front of him. "Eat." Marco looked at it. "Why so much food?" "Because your father has a guest." "Who?" "Dino Falco." That woke Marco up a little. He looked toward the dining room. Luca noticed it immediately. He noticed everything. Soon enough, Vittorio entered dressed in a dark charcoal suit, already ready for the day. He kissed Elena's cheek, nodded to Sophia, glanced at Marco, and rested a hand briefly on Luca's shoulder as he passed. No wasted gestures, but never empty ones. Not long after, Dino Falco arrived. Luca saw him first from the upstairs landing. Dino removed his hat in the front hall and held it with both hands. He was not a weak man. He had broad shoulders, a thick moustache, and the kind of face that looked permanent. But this morning, there was a tiredness in him that was easy to see. Vittorio welcomed him not into the office, but into the salon. That meant something too. The office was for decisions. The salon was for trust. Luca stayed halfway hidden behind the rail of the staircase and listened. Elena herself brought in coffee. "Signora," Dino said quietly, "you did not need to do that." Eleanor placed the tray on the low table. "I know." Dino gave a tired smile. When she left, Vittorio sat opposite him. "What happened last night?" he asked. Dino looked down at the cup before answering. "They came again. stood outside in the rain like they had nowhere better to be. My wife saw them first, then one of the waiters. Half the room noticed before I could pretend not to. They entered. No. They spoke. No. Vittorio leaned back slightly. That's good. Dino looked up. Good? They want to feel important. Men like that often say too much when you let them. Dino rubbed his thumb along the edge of the cup. My daughter doesn't want to be there at night anymore. Vittorio's face softened only a fraction. And you? Dino laughed once, bitterly. I'm angry. Vittorio nodded. Good. Again Dino frowned. Good. Fear makes men bend. Anger keeps them standing. Dino sat with that for a moment. Then he looked up. What do you want me to do? You open tonight. In this weather? Especially in this weather. Dino exhaled. And if they come back? Vittorio met his eyes calmly. They won't. Dino stared at him. No big speech followed. No explanation. No dramatic promise. Just certainty. That was enough. At the top of the stairs, Luca held the rail tightly. He was beginning to understand something about his father. Vittorio did not calm people by making them feel safe. He calmed them by making doubt disappear. Later that day, Luca found himself in the courtyard with a small leather ball, throwing it against the wall and catching it again. Marco stepped out from under the covered walkway, lighting a cigarette. You spying again? Luca caught the ball. No, you're bad at lying. I wasn't lying. Marco took the cigarette out of his mouth and smirked. You know what's funny about you? Luca bounced the ball once. No. You hear all this stuff. You see all this stuff. But you never ask me about any of it. Luca caught the ball again. You tell things anyway. Marco laughed. Fair. He walked closer and leaned against a stone pillar. But I'll tell you something for free. Men like Dino, men like Papa, men like Renato, they live in a different world. Luca looked up. What world? Marco took a drag from the cigarette and looked past the wall toward the city beyond. The world under the world. Luca repeated it in his head. Bellora had a world under the world. That sounded impossible. And true. Marco glanced at him. You'll see it one day. How? Marco looked at him, then smiled. In this family, you don't get much choice. He flicked ash onto the wet stone. Then he added, with mock seriousness, also, if you tell Mama I'm smoking, I'll blame you. Luca answered immediately. She already knows. Marco stared. Then he laughed so hard he nearly dropped the cigarette. That, he said, pointing at Luca, that was good. That afternoon, the rain got heavier. By evening, Bellora looked like a painting done in dark glass and gold. Street lamps stretched across wet roads, car lights shimmered across puddles. Restaurant windows glowed warm against the cold. At the harbour, Falco's opened on time. Luca was not there, but he imagined it. The chairs set out, the white cloths straightened, the front window polished. Dino's wife fixing her earrings in the mirror before the first customers arrived. In the Valentieri house, Vittorio dressed for the evening in silence. Luca watched him from the doorway of the dressing room. Vittorio adjusted his cuffs. You need something? He asked without turning. Luca hesitated. Where are you going? To work. At night? Yes. Luca thought for a second. To Dino's restaurant. Vittorio turned then, fastening one cufflink. Why do you think that? Because of what Renato said. Because Dino came here. Because you told him to open tonight. Because if he opens, Someone has to make sure it stays open. Vittorio studied him for a moment. Then he gave one small nod. That is good thinking. Luca stood a little straighter. Can I come? No. Why? Because you are 9. Luca frowned. That's not a real reason. For the first time, Vittorio almost smiled. It is tonight. Elena appeared from down the hall. He asked to go with you. Vittorio replied, he did. Elena looked at Luca with a mix of love and warning. You will not. Luca knew better than to push when both parents were in agreement. He nodded. All right. But after Vittorio left, he waited at the upstairs window for a long time. From there he could see the front gate open. A black car rolled out into the rain. Renato was in the front passenger seat. Paolo Rizzi, one of the family's most trusted drivers, sat behind the wheel. Vittorio was in the back. The car disappeared down the street and into Bellora's wet evening. Luca stayed at the window until Elena found him. You should be getting ready for bed. He didn't turn right away. Will Papa be safe? Elena stood beside him and looked out into the night. For a brief moment, her face changed. Not much, just enough. The kind of change Luca had taught himself never to miss. Your father knows how to move through Bellora, she said. That was not the same as yes. Luca noticed that too. Do you worry? Sometimes. Then why doesn't he stop? Elena smiled, though sadly. Because men like your father are not made for small lives. She bent, kissed his forehead, and brushed his hair back with her hand. Come now. Luca nodded and followed her, but even in bed he stayed awake longer than he should have, listening for the gate, the engine, the footsteps in the hall. He heard them after midnight. The low growl of the car first, then the gate, then voices, then the front door. He got up quietly and opened his bedroom door a crack. From the upstairs landing, he could see part of the entrance hall below. Renato stood there, removing his gloves. Paolo had already gone. Vittorio was speaking softly. Elena appeared at the foot of the stairs in her robe. Well? Vittorio removed his coat and handed it to the maid. It's finished. Elena searched his face. And no one will stand outside Falco's again. Renato muttered, not if they plan to keep standing at all. Elena shot him a look. Renato lifted both hands. What? It's true. Vittorio said nothing. That silence told Luca enough to know that something had happened. He went back into his room and lay awake a little longer. Not scared, not exactly, just aware. Bellora was bigger than he had thought. And sharper too. The next morning, Marco came into breakfast, holding the newspaper like it contained a secret. He unfolded it and dropped into his chair. Nothing. Sophia looked up. What? Nothing happened. Elena buttered toast. That is often the best kind of morning. Marco tapped the paper. No mention of Falco's, no trouble at the harbour, no smashed windows, no police story, nothing. Vittorio entered and sat. He poured coffee calmly. Marco looked over the edge of the paper. So that's it? Vittorio took a sip. That's what? It's over. For Dino, yes. That easy. Vittorio set down the cup. The cleanest solution is often the one no one hears about. Sophia smiled faintly. You should put that in a book. Marco ignored her. But what did you do? Vittorio looked at him. What needed to be done? Marco groaned. You never answer anything directly. No, Vittorio replied. I answer enough. Luca sat quietly, taking in every word. This was Bellora too. Questions asked openly, answers given halfway. Everyone understanding more than was being said. After breakfast, Sophia found Luca in the library. He sat in a deep leather chair with a book open in his lap, though he had not turned the page in several minutes. Sophia leaned in the doorway. "You look like an old banker." Luca glanced up. "I'm thinking." "That much is obvious." She came inside and sat on the arm of the chair. "You're thinking about Papa." Luca nodded. Sophia folded her hands. "Do you know why Marco wants everyone looking at him?" "No." "Because he thinks being seen is the same as being important." Luca looked down at the book. "And Papa?" Sophia was quiet for a moment. "Papa doesn't need to be seen. That's why he matters." Luca looked up at her. "I want to understand it." Sophia studied his face. "Understand what?" "How Bellora works." She smiled, but it was not a playful smile this time. "When you're older," she said, "you will." Then she looked toward the window, where rain slid down the glass in thin silver lines. "And when you do, you may wish you didn't." Luca said nothing, because part of him already believed her. A few days later, the rain finally cleared, and Bellora seemed to breathe again. The market square filled with noise. Men shouted over crates of fruit. Women bargained. Scooters slid through narrow streets. Laundry appeared on balconies. Life resumed its visible shape. Vittorio took Luca with him into the city that afternoon. Not for business officially, just errands. At least that was what Eleanor called it. "Back in 2 hours," she said, adjusting Luca's collar before he left. "And no teaching him terrible habits." Vittorio put on his gloves. "I make no promises." Eleanor gave him a look. "That," she said, "is exactly what worries me." In the car, Luca sat beside Vittorio in the back while Paolo drove. The city passed in pieces through the window. Flower stalls, a church square, a butcher sweeping his steps, 2 boys kicking a ball against a wall, a man delivering fabric bolts into a shop. Vittorio noticed Luca watching everything. "What do you see?" Luca answered seriously. "People." Vittorio gave a slight nod. "That is where most men start. What else?" Luca kept looking out. Which shops are busy? Which ones are empty? Who stops to talk? Who doesn't? Vittorio said, "Good." The car slowed near a corner cafe. 3 men stood outside with coffee cups, talking quietly. One of them noticed the car and stepped slightly aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. Luca saw that too. "Do they know you?" "Some do." "Do you know them?" "Yes." "All of them?" Vittorio looked at him. "Enough of them." That answer stayed with Luca. Enough of them. In Bellora, maybe no one knew everyone, but some men knew enough. Their first stop was a tailor's shop. The tailor, Mr. Baresi, came around the counter smiling warmly. "Vittorio, and this must be the young one." "Luca." Mr. Baresi bent slightly. "You grow every time I see you." Luca shook his hand properly, the way Elena had taught him. "Good afternoon." The tailor smiled wider. "Better manners than your brother." Vittorio answered dryly, "That is not a difficult achievement." From there they stopped at a florist's near the square. An older woman named Mrs. Doria stood arranging white roses when they entered. She looked up at once. "Vittorio, you came yourself." "I was nearby." "No one is ever simply nearby," she said. Her eyes shifted to Luca. "And this is Luca." Luca nodded politely. Mrs. Doria smiled. The quiet one. Luca wasn't sure whether that was a compliment. While Vittorio looked over flowers, Mrs. Doria leaned slightly toward Luca and said in a lower voice, "A quiet child hears more than noisy adults." Luca blinked. "Sometimes," he said. She smiled as if he had answered correctly. When they left the shop, Luca asked, "Do you know everyone?" Vittorio glanced at him. "No. It feels like you do. It only feels that way because I remember people." Luca thought about that. Why? Because being remembered matters. They walked toward the river after that. The afternoon sun reflected off the water in long, soft lines. Boats moved lazily. Men unloaded crates farther down. The harbour always smelled of salt, rope, diesel, and fish, no matter the season. As they approached Falco's restaurant, Dino himself stepped out from inside, wiping his hands on a towel. He smiled the moment he saw them. Vittorio. Dino. Dino looked at Luca. And the boy too. Luca gave a small nod. Dino's face was easier today. The tiredness had lifted. "Come in," he said, "at least for coffee." Inside, the restaurant was warm, busy, and full of the kind of noise that meant life was going on as it should. Plates clinked. A waiter laughed near the back. Someone in the kitchen shouted that the fish was ready. Dino led them to a table near the window. As they sat, Dino looked at Luca and smiled. "You know, your father came here when he was younger than people remember." Vittorio gave him a look. "Careful." Dino laughed. "It's true." Luca looked at his father. "You did?" "Yes." "What for?" Dino answered before Vittorio could. "To learn." Luca frowned slightly. "Learn what?" Dino spread his hands around the room. "How a place works. Who pays on time? Who drinks too much? Who watches the door? Who says one thing and means another?" Luca looked around the restaurant in a new way now. Not as a customer, as a system. Dino leaned in slightly. "Your father sat in that corner over there for a week once. Hardly spoke at all." Luca looked at Vittorio. "Really?" Vittorio took a sip of coffee. "Yes." Dino laughed. "The only difference is, back then he had less expensive shoes." Luca smiled. Vittorio almost did too. Then Dino's expression softened. He looked at Vittorio and said quietly, "Thank you." Vittorio answered simply, "Open well, feed people, keep the place alive." Dino nodded. "I will." That scene stayed with Luca more than he knew, not because of danger, because of what came after it. A business open, a man standing straight again, a room full of life that might have gone dark. Maybe power was not only about stopping trouble, maybe it was also about keeping things alive. That evening at dinner, Marco noticed Luca was quieter than usual. "Well," he asked, "you've been with Papa all day. Learn any secrets?" Luca tore a piece of bread. "Maybe." Marco leaned forward. "And?" Luca looked at him calmly. "If I tell you, they won't be secrets." Sophia laughed. Marco stared at him. Did he really say that? Elena smiled into her glass. Vittorio said nothing, but Luca saw it. That almost invisible look again. Approval. After dinner, Marco followed Luca into the hall. "You're getting bold." Luca shrugged. "You should be careful," Marco said, though he was smiling. "Soon people will think you're interesting." Luca looked at him. "And is that bad?" Marco thought about it. Then he said, "In this family, sometimes." That night, Luca stood at his bedroom window looking out over Bellora. The city glowed softly beyond Santiero. Here and there a window was still lit. Cars moved like dark shapes under yellow lamps. Far off, down toward the river, Bellora still hummed with quiet life. Behind Luca, the room still looked like a child's room. Books stacked on a shelf, a toy soldier near the bed, a jacket hanging slightly crooked behind the door. Ahead of him was Bellora, the city his family seemed to understand in ways he did not yet, the world under the world. He thought about Dino at the restaurant, about Marco in the courtyard, about Mrs. Doria's words, about Renato saying he was not a child for long, about Sophia saying understanding Bellora might one day feel like a burden, about Vittorio moving through the city as if he already knew how every problem would end. Luca placed one hand on the window frame. He did not yet know the jobs he would one day do. He did not know about the harbour accounts, the late-night drives, the messages carried by hand, the lies traded in back rooms, the betrayals that would split friendships open, or the people he would lose. He did not know that one day men across Bellora would lower their voices when saying his name. He did not know that one day he would stand by a different window, in a different room, looking out over the whole city, as people waited for his answer. All he knew now was this. Bellora was larger than it looked. The Valentieri name meant more than he had been told. And somewhere beyond the walls of his childhood, a second city was already waiting for him. So he stayed there a little longer, quiet and still, looking out into the night, watching, listening, already becoming someone